Director of Graduate Studies and teaches courses in rhetoric, political communication, and gender and communication. She studies the culture of politics, examining the ways in which political identity is rhetorically constructed in popular media. Dr. Anderson is co-author of 2 books, Women President, Confronting Postfeminist Political Culture, and Governing Codes, Gender, Metaphor, and Political Identity. It is my honor to warmly welcome Dr. Anderson to the New Hampshire Institute of Politics for what is sure to be a great discussion tonight. Please.
Thank you so much, Guy, for that introduction. It was very wonderful to be here. I've spent the day on campus. You have a beautiful campus. Everyone is so warm and hospitable. I wanted to thank very much Ann Kamen for helping me make all the arrangements to get here tonight. It's been wonderful. I very much appreciate my former colleagues, Dr. John Lupo and Dr. Chani Marchicelli, when they said that I could come out here and speak to you, on this platform. And I did a little bit of internet research, and it didn't take me long to figure out just how austere my company would be as those who've spoken to you at this stage. So I'm really, really pleased and honored to be here. I also want to thank my husband, Thad, who was able to make the trip out with me, and he's over here. We will. I think that even with the question and answer period, we should have you out before at least the end of the first inning. So go Red Sox. I'm a little sore still at the Red Sox for taking out the Rockies in a sweep the last time we were in the World Series. So, but I'm putting that behind me, and you all are helping me heal. So thank you. Tonight, we're going to talk about political memes. 2012 was a pretty good year for political memes. After Clint Eastwood lectured invisible Barack Obama at the Republican National Convention, the Eastwooding meme was born, and it had some legs, lasted for a while. The Republican and Democratic debate season also brought us some pretty memorable memes. After Mitt Romney said that he might cut funding to PBS as part of his overall budget reduction strategy, the Big Burn meme was born. And poor Mitt Romney, he also, of course, was trying to tout his record of attracting women to be in his, to work for him in his gubernatorial office, and used the unfortunate phrase, binders full of women, which led to this meme. And I honestly don't know the origin of Paul Ryan Gosling, but now that I've seen it, I can't unsee it. So. By far, however, the most popular political meme in 2012 was Stacey Lamb and Adam Smith's Text from Hillary. The inaugural Text from Hillary post set the tone for the blog, awarding Clinton the upper hand in her exchange with President Barack Obama. "Hey, Hill, what you doing? Running the world," was, of course, her response, suggesting that she, rather than Obama at the time, was the acting leader of the free world. Text from Hillary also situated Clinton in a number of power positions over important male politicians, spoofing John Boehner's propensity to become overcome with emotion, blowing off Colin Powell's invitation to his birthday party, apparently, and demonstrating disdain for her underperforming fellow cabinet member, Timothy Geithner. Meanwhile, texts from Hillary cast the president and vice president as buffoons, suggesting that Hillary was really the only responsible adult in Washington, D.C. She even pulled rank with Ryan Gosling, and she celebrated her power with Rachel Maddow, who asks who run the world. Clinton's one-word reply articulates the meme's central argument: girls. Yahoo News dubbed Text from Hillary the best political meme of 2012, and MSNBC asserted that the Tumblr creation showed Clinton at her coolest. By late April 2012, pundits were once again bandying about the P word. Howard Feynman says, Clinton wins solid marks as Secretary of State, rides a wave of cult status on the web, and watches as the Beltway chattering classes wonder aloud whether she will be a candidate for president in 2016. By presenting Hillary Clinton as the alpha female of political culture, Text from Hillary constructs a post-feminist political fantasy. Despite the fact that she lost her bid to become commander-in-chief in 2008, Text from Hillary argues that Clinton emerged in 2012 as the de facto leader of the free world, someone who was beloved rather than reviled for her power. The cheerful girl power feminism of Texts from Hillary elevates the fictional Clinton over her peers, even as it obscures the hegemonic masculinity that stymied the real Clinton's political career. Tonight, we're going to confront post-feminist political culture and examine its impact on U.S. presidentiality. After explaining what I mean by feminism, post-feminism, and anti-feminism, and providing a few examples for how they work their way into the culture, I will argue that insofar as post-feminism is both supplanting and camouflaging anti-feminism, post-feminism is the new vehicle of a backlash against female presidentiality, the undeclared war against the American woman president. Now, defining feminism is a tricky task because there are almost as many definitions of feminism as there are people who call themselves feminists. But there's two foundational principles, and those are equality and gender justice. For feminists believe that people of all sexes and genders deserve equal value, treatment, and access in society, and when equality isn't accorded, they work for gender justice. Bonnie J. Dow and Celeste Condit define gender justice as seeking equality between men and women and understanding that the category of gender is itself politically constructed. Now, just as the category gender is politically constructed, so is the category U.S. president. If the scholarly aim of my research is to understand gendered presidentiality as a rhetorical phenomenon, well, then personally, or as a feminist, I want to find out why it's been so hard to elect a woman to the White House. That's the sort of political goal that corresponds to my scholarly aim. As a scholar, I want to more fully understand discourses of presidentiality, and as a feminist, I want to do something that helps a woman to get to the White House. But not just any woman. I would prefer somebody to be elected U.S. president who supports gender justice, as opposed to somebody who sort of tacitly tolerates anti-feminist positions or embraces a post-feminist worldview. Tonight, I will argue that both anti-feminism and post-feminism compete with traditional feminism in U.S. culture, and both are instruments of backlash against U.S. presidentiality. Now, despite the real and significant gains made by women in the public sphere, anti-feminism is rampant in political culture. Anti-feminism often comes in the form of pundits or politicians suggesting that women are ill-suited for governance, primarily because they are women or because of characteristics that we define as female. Now, I'm going to give you a small example, and this is really kind of a fleeting example, something you wouldn't necessarily notice until you see several examples lined up together. This is a quotation from Chris Matthews, MSNBC's Chris Matthews, and he was digesting a speech, the victory speech that Hillary Clinton gave after she was elected to her second term in the U.S. Senate. And he said, "We were watching Hillary Clinton earlier tonight. She was giving a campaign barn burner speech, which is hard to give for a woman. It can grate on some men when they listen to it, fingernails on a chalkboard perhaps." All right, so we had this little moment. Again, it's live TV. We all know how much Chris Matthews talks and talks and talks. So it was just one of the small things that he said in the aftermath of her winning her Senate seat. 2 years later, when she was running for president, however, the issue of Hillary's voice and whether or not it was grating came up multiple times. We're going to listen to two clips, and in both cases, Pat Buchanan is speaking, and he's talking about the tenor of her voice and contrasting it unfavorably with the more sonically pleasant Barack Obama.
Last night, she was serene, she was self-confident, she was in control, she had the look of a winner. As Chris said, only once or twice did that voice start rising to the level that every husband in America at one time or another has heard, you know, when it starts going up.
Buchanan.
I know, but she only a couple of times.
Shelley is going to get you.
But it was
So that was one program. He repeats this on a different episode of the same program, Morning Joe.
So it's a very, very tough thing, and as Mika, as you've mentioned correctly, we've talked about, it's very tough for a woman. You see two men going back and forth at each other, you say, boy, they're really going at it.
Yeah.
And you see two women or something, they say, boy, what a cat fight this is.
Well, you know, and that's what's so unfair. And Willie, I know your question about the polls. We'll get to that. But, you know, you think about what she said over the weekend, the sound bites that have been isolated. And imagine those coming from the mouth of a male candidate. And he'd look strong and aggressive, like a fighter. And what's happening here with Hillary?
Well, frankly, it's the voice. Look, Barack Obama's got a very deep voice. He can go out, he can use mockery and ridicule, and it comes off very smooth and pleasant. But when she raises her voice, and when a lot of women do, you know, it's, as I say, it reaches a point where every husband in America has heard it one time or another.
Oh, Pat, you're lucky you're not here in the studio. I'm telling you.
I know that's a sexist comment.
It totally is.
There's truth to it.
Yeah,
there's truth to it. It's very difficult for women to reach those kinds of levels effectively as it is to make them sort of a rally speech. They're not good at that. She's very good at the debate, the debate format.
There is something so wrong with what you're saying, and what I fear is that the effect may be exactly what you're saying because of this double standard, that people can't hear strength from a woman without using the B word. And
I thought it was particularly ironic that Pat Buchanan was complaining about Hillary Clinton's vocal register because he does not have a particularly sonorous voice himself. I, on the other hand, can identify with people thinking that your speaking voice is perhaps lacking gravitas. So I'm a little sensitive to that. Now, Brzezinski and Buchanan were talking about this in terms of presidential debate strategy. So they weren't necessarily coming out and saying, don't vote for Hillary Clinton because she doesn't sound like a president. They were talking instead about, is this going to hurt her in terms of public perception? But that narrative about her voice wound its way through conservative talk radio, and this is what happened in that case.
I'm hearing and reading reviews by Democrats saying, oh, Hillary made a wonderful speech last night on behalf of Barack Obama. First, let's be clear about this. With that screechy fingernails on the blackboard voice of hers, it is impossible for Hillary Clinton to deliver a great speech. And that high-pitched, whiny sing-song. And
all right. Writing for New York Magazine, near the end of Clinton's primary bid, Amanda Fortini made this observation. Although many women believe that we had access to the same opportunities and experiences as men, after Clinton declared her candidacy, the sexism in America, long lying dormant like some feral, tranquilized animal, yawned and revealed itself. Sadly, she was correct. Fortini in her essay chronicled some of the more egregious examples. One was the Facebook group that said, Hillary Clinton, stop running for president and make me a sandwich. That boasted 44,000 members on Facebook. Another example were the gentlemen who followed her around at her campaign stops, holding up that sign and yelling out, iron my shirt, during her speeches. What I find even more egregious, though, than the fact that there were a group of young men following her around holding up a sign, iron my shirt, was what happened when USA Today covered it. All right, their headline says, Clinton responds to seemingly sexist shouts. And I'm just wondering what would have to happen for USA Today to go out on a limb and say that it was actually sexist if stop running for president and iron my shirt is not. All right. Of course, that sadly wasn't the most egregious example. I don't know how many people were familiar with the next group, which was not a spoof group. It was a real group. Citizens United Not Timid. They were a tax-exempt group to educate the American people about what Hillary Clinton really is. This is not the Citizens United of the Campaign Finance Reform Supreme Court Act. That's a different group. This group was organized primarily just so they could put this acronym on a T-shirt and political buttons and everything else and go around campaigning with it. All right, the C word, unfortunately, made more than one appearance in the 2008 primary season. This shirt was spotted a lot of different places. The I Love Country Music slogan was illustrated with the pictogram of an eye, a heart, a head of Hillary Clinton, a tree, and a musical staff. Unfortunately, scholarly assessments of the 2008 campaign confirm that there was a broad presence of sexism in the 2008 campaign. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents on the digital fringe. Erica Falk, who's a communications scholar, argues that media bias against Clinton was not surprising, given the historical trends that shows that women candidates for president persistently experience differentiation in coverage, that gendered words are used and they're not covered as frequently as male candidates who have the same political standing in identical offices. Falk also stated that what was surprising when she studied the 2008 campaign was that such a disparity was present when the woman was the frontrunner, as was Hillary Clinton, and that such a pattern manifest in press coverage since 1884 was still about the same in 2007, that the patterns of coverage and the coverage trends were likely the same. All right. Well, despite the prominence of anti-feminism in political culture, though, it does seem when we look at these examples, when we pull them out and take a look at them, they do seem anachronistic. People readily recognize them as sexist and condemn them as such. So anti-feminism is really not strategically sound as a political strategy in contemporary U.S. culture. Enter post-feminism. If anti-feminism rages against the feminist machine, then post-feminism seductively suggests that feminism's work is complete, and therefore a politics of gender justice is irrelevant, unnecessary, or passé. Post-feminism is the label given to a wide variety of social and intellectual responses to the feminist movement of the 1970s. As women achieved greater representation in political, professional, and economic spheres, there began to be a reaction against this gender equity in 1970s feminism. So opponents of the feminist movement initially responded with a backlash, something that Susan Faludi chronicled in her very famous 1991 book entitled Backlash. And she noted that that produced the sort of successes, the early successes of 1970s liberal feminism, produced a cultural backlash that was manifest in entertainment, pop culture, business, and other spheres. Happily, we've moved away from that sort of really egregious anti-feminism, although we did see plenty of examples of it, as we just saw pop up in 2008. But because it's recognized as kind of anachronistic, then post-feminism developed as an alternative discourse that was surprisingly effective at doing anti-feminism's dirty work. Proponents of post-feminism suggest that although select legal reforms secured by feminists, such as the right to vote or laws against sexual harassment, they acknowledge that those are a good thing and should have happened. However, they also argue that the problems of gender inequity have largely been solved. And for that reason, contemporary feminist politics are unnecessary, passé, or even potentially damaging. Post-feminism is a particularly pernicious cultural force because its proponents often claim to be feminists, even at the same time that they work against feminist policies or politics. Now, much of the scholarly attention that's been paid to post-feminism has focused on its emergence in the pop culture sphere. So the sort of Sex and the City girl is the poster child for post-feminism. It's a woman who is on her own and very successful economically and in charge of her relationships and is succeeding kind of absent a politics of gender justice. But more recently, post-feminism has infiltrated the political sphere. Sarah Palin and her fellow Mama Grizzlies often articulate a politics of post-feminism when they're out on the campaign trail. This trend is noteworthy, in particular because a defining characteristic of post-feminism has been depoliticization. So there's this notion that if women were highly political in the 1970s with consciousness-raising efforts and comprising a social movement, the women's movement, that post-feminism kind of emptied feminist equity or feminine equity of its politics. So what's notable about this new trend is that we have a repoliticization of post-feminism, that post-feminist is opting into the political sphere. In the 1980s, postfeminism kind of gave way to the girl power consumerism that was so popular in pop culture. But in the 2000s, there's been this explicit politicization of postfeminism. And strategies that were once kind of confined to popular culture are infiltrating political culture. When Sarah Palin gave a speech to the Susan B. Anthony List, which is an anti-abortion political action group that funds anti-abortion candidates, she likened this trend of post-feminists rushing into politics as a stampede of pink elephants converging on Washington, D.C. And in this speech, she has kind of extended articulation of her version of feminism, which is really a great illustration of what I mean by post-feminism.
Home to a new conservative feminist movement is how I look at this. It's an emerging conservative feminist identity. Far too long, when people heard the word feminist, they thought of the faculty lounge at some East Coast women's college, right? And no offense to them, they have their opinions and their voice, and God bless them, they're just great, but that's not the only voice of women in America. I'd like to remind people of another feminist tradition, kind of a Western feminism. It's influenced by the pioneering spirit of our foremothers who went in wagon trains across the wilderness and they settled in homesteads. And these were tough, independent, pioneering mothers whose work was as valuable as any man's on the frontier. And it's no surprise that our Western states that gave women the vote, the right to vote, way before their East Coast sisters in a more genteel city perhaps got it right. These women, they had dirt under their fingernails, and they could shoot a gun and push a plow and raise a family all at the same time. These women are frontier foremothers. They loved this country, and they made sacrifices to carve out a living and a family life out of the wilderness. They went where no woman had gone before. I kind of feel a connection to that tough, gun-toting pioneer feminism of women like Annie Oakley in them. Maybe it's that upbringing in Alaska. Maybe too, it's because later on today I do a speech for the NRA and kind of getting in the groove. Yeah. I'm proud to call myself a Western conservative in the tradition of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, understanding those Western values too, those small town values, and as an Alaskan woman, I'm proud to consider myself a frontier feminist, like those early pioneering women of the West. Now, maybe my jumping on a national stage was a bit of a shock to some people who may not have considered what an independent pioneering spirit, that I was brought up with, what that could look like. Maybe there was a lot of shock out there jumping on that national stage, but I know that some left-wing feminists, they sure didn't know what to make of an Alaskan chick out there talking about the Second Amendment and talking about raising family and kids, the more the merrier, and you know, all that. Well, some of them even refused to admit I was even a woman. Jeez, they're...
All right. So, although a commitment to gender justice doesn't necessarily preclude, doesn't trample on gun rights necessarily, it doesn't preclude family or fun, but that sort of notion of what feminism is on the one hand and what conservative feminism is on the other hand is something that Palin, it's real central to her political identity. Now, Palin's post-feminism was evident when she was on the ticket as John McCain's running mate. When she was campaigning as a vice presidential hopeful, she had the series of interviews with Katie Couric. And we're just going to watch a short snippet from that in which Katie Couric asks Sarah Palin if she considers herself to be a feminist. Her extended answer reveals the ways in which feminism's call for gender justice gets repurposed by post-feminists as a kind of breezy assertion that feminism's work is already done.
I do. Feminist who believes in equal rights, and I believe that women certainly today have every opportunity that a man has to succeed and to try to do it all anyway. And very, very thankful that I've been brought up in a family where gender hasn't been an issue. You know, I've been expected to do everything growing up that the boys were doing. We were out chopping wood, and we were out hunting and fishing and filling our freezer with good wild Alaskan game to feed our family. So it kind of started with that.
So what we hear from that clip is that for a post-feminist like Palin, the only thing that you really should say about gender is that it doesn't matter. And in fact, acknowledging any structural oppression that lingers in U.S. culture for a post-feminist would be a barrier to women's political progress. In 2008, post-feminism also shaped our view of women as a voting bloc. Women voters, particularly unmarried women voters, became an important demographic after the 2000 presidential election, when George W. Bush narrowly beat Al Gore, and some demographic analysis revealed that if a bunch of unmarried women who didn't vote would have gone and voted, and as the analysis showed, this particular group of women likely would have voted for Al Gore in greater numbers than for Bush. And it looks like if they would have turned out at the polls, they could have turned the election. So after that, there became a big determination to turn out this voting group in subsequent presidential and midterm elections. In 2004, this voting group was called the Sex and the City voter, and that kind of is an illustration of the ways in which this pop culture view of women's power was integrating its way into political dialogue. Now, some women's groups at the time objected to that label because it was, you know, kind of classist and over-sexualized and racially homogenized, and so there was some contestation of that Sex and the City voter label. But the logic of how we needed to appeal to and turn out the so-called Sex and the City voter lingered all the way through the 2008 presidential campaign. I'm going to show two examples. The first is a political ad that was put out by the nonpartisan Women's Voices Women's Vote, and their sole objective as an organization was to turn out the young unmarried woman's vote. And so they started running this commercial in 2006 during the midterm elections, and it's built around the theme of your first time.
You want me to tell you about the first time I did it?
I think the best time is in the fall.
When was it? What year?
I like to do it in the morning when I'm fresh.
It's kind of personal.
And I feel that, you know, my synapses are clicking.
It was the summer of love, 1968.
I did a lot of research on the positions that I liked.
Once I did it in an old woman's garage,
Other people's houses.
Well, it made me feel powerful.
Really important.
it's cool.
Pretty.
Sexy.
I felt grown up.
I wasn't a kid anymore. All of a sudden, I felt liberated.
I have been disappointed, yes, when I didn't do it.
The first man that I had a crush on, it wasn't my dad, was John F. Kennedy. And I really wanted to do it for him.
I made a good choice.
You got all that energy flowing inside, and you go in and commit. It's a beautiful thing.
All right, so that same storyline that sort of cast the civic duty of voting as a sexual encounter was repeated in 2008. This time the commercial starred Girls creator Lena Dunham. She created the series Girls for HBO and stars in it. And she cut this commercial for the Obama campaign.
Your first time shouldn't be with just anybody. You want to do it with a great guy. It should be with a guy with beautiful, someone who really cares about and understands women. A guy who cares whether you get health insurance, and specifically whether you get birth control. The consequences are huge. You want to do it with a guy who brought the troops out of Iraq. You don't want a guy who says, oh, hey, I'm at the library studying, when really he's out not signing the Lilly Ledbetter Act. Or who thinks that gay people should never have beautiful, complicated weddings of the kind we see on Bravo or TLC all the time. It's a fun game to say, who are you voting for? And they say, I don't want to tell you. And you say, no, who are you voting for? And they go, guess. Think about how you want to spend those 4 years. In college age time, that's 150 years. It's also super uncool to be out and about. Someone says, did you vote? And you go, no, I wasn't ready. My first time voting was amazing. It was this line in the sand. Before I was a girl, now I was a woman. I went to the polling station, I pulled back the curtain, I voted for Barack Obama.
All right. Now, your first time themed ads were fairly good-natured ribbing. They weren't, attacking a female candidate. But a lot of these highly sexualized notions of sexualization of voting or the sexualization of women candidates can have pretty devastating effects. The most popular, and we're going to see another example here, and it was the most popular viral video in the 2008 campaign cycle. It launched the website barelypolitical.com, and it created an internet icon, Obama Girl. I don't know how many of you were familiar with this. Hopefully many of you in this room were too young to be looking at this on the internet in 2008. But for those who are not, we're going to see a quick clip.
You seem to float onto the floor. Democratic Convention 2004. I never wanted anybody more than I wanted you. So I put down my carry sign. Knew I had to make you mine. My black and sexy, you're so fine. 'Cause I gotta cry. Obama, wait till 2008. Baby, you're the best candidate. I like it when you get hard on Hillary in debate. Won't you pick up your phone? 'Cause I gotta cry. Obama, wait till 2008. Baby, you're the best candidate. Up in the Oval Office, you'll get your head of state. I can't leave you alone. 'Cause I gotta cry, Sean Obama.
Now, on one hand, this video looks like very familiar old-school sexism. The aesthetic mirrors that of hip-hop videos, with Obama Girl, the girl campaigner, as a sex star of Ho, and Obama as the stud she is eager to service. But what was disturbing about this image was how it was incorporated into U.S. political culture. Obama Girl Amberly Ettinger's personal website showcases videos from her multiple appearances on Fox News, ABC, MSNBC. She was featured multiple times on NPR, discussed in major national newspapers, referenced in news magazines. Matt Bai, writing for the New York Times, asserted that the Crush on Obama video probably had more to do with shaping Obama's complicated public image than any internet appeal devised by the candidate's own campaign. Now, although viral videos certainly don't impinge on anybody's right or ability to vote, the extent that these images form a media frame, especially for positioning women voters, they undermine and rhetorically dismiss women's political agency. Now, post-feminist appeals don't always over-sexualize their subjects, thankfully. More recent media coverage of the Text from Hillary's story illustrates the way in which the narrative of post-feminist girl power encourages the audience to ignore evidence of structural or systemic sexism. When Text from Hillary went viral, journalistic coverage of it frequently included an important contrast. As pundits hailed her newfound popularity in 2012, they also criticized her previous bid for presidency. So her current success was often positioned in tandem with her failure as a presidential figure. After noting that in the past few weeks, have been pretty good to Hillary Clinton, Salon reminded its readers that 4 years ago this week, she pressed on with her presidential campaign despite falling hopelessly behind in the delegate race. And a survey found that 54% of Americans viewed the First Lady unfavorably. What's really interesting about that particular quotation is that she was sitting Secretary of State at that point, and they didn't refer to her as Secretary Clinton or even Senator Clinton. They went all the way back to her time as a First Lady when she was a highly polarizing figure. Additionally, Talking Points Memo's Benji Sarlin cheerfully proclaimed what a difference 4 years makes. When she was running for the Democratic presidential nomination, Hillary Clinton was parodied as drab and calculated, especially compared with the young and vigorous Barack Obama and winking and fresh-faced Sarah Palin. In his discussion of the multiple factors that could have contributed to the April 2012 Hillary boomlet, Howard Kurtz, who is a media ethicist, suggested that it was due in part to a personal transformation. The woman has always been so carefully controlled in the public stage, so guarded in keeping her emotions in check, that a brief choking up in a New Hampshire diner, anybody remember that episode? A little bit, was hailed as a breakthrough. These days, she seems considerably looser. Democratic partisan and Clinton supporter Paul Begala took Kurtz's critique one step further, asserting that her 2008 campaign was a mess, and touting Clinton's surprising and oppressive ability to blend harmoniously with Team Obama. Well, the narrative that emerged in April 2012 was a distinctly post-feminist one. Women can and do capably run for president. They have the potential to be as popular with the U.S. electorate as male candidates. Any failure of their candidacies should properly be ascribed to their personal shortcomings or strategic miscalculations, rather than to the continued evidence of sexism in U.S. culture. Columnist Maureen Dowd was one of the few journalists to recognize the implicit sexism present in the post-feminist story of Clinton's resurgent appeal in 2012. She stated, "Hillary has a history of being more popular when she seems less in control. Losing to Obama and becoming his hard-working subordinate has, at times, won her higher approval ratings than the president." In fact, in the spring of 2012, not only was Clinton not an active presidential candidate at that time, there was that sort of slim moment where people didn't know for sure if she was positioning for a run, but she was also poised to leave her position as Secretary of State. So, Maureen Dowd observed in her article, now that she seems ready to leave the stage at 64 and take a deserved nap, she is at her least polarizing. Dowd's assessment underscores the claim that my co-author and I make in our book, and that is that Americans have always preferred potential female presidential candidates to actual ones. Depictions of Hillary Clinton running the world are appealing only when she's not actually the one running it. Now, earlier this summer, people began speculating again about whether or not Clinton was destined to run the world after all. In June, Hillary Clinton took to the Twitterverse. Her inaugural tweet spent some text from Hillary Capital, and she said in her tweet, "Thanks for the inspiration, A. Smith and S. Lamb. I'll take it from here, hashtag tweets from Hillary." Although social media provide political figures like Clinton the opportunity to communicate directly with citizens outside that media filter, it was not Twitter's open conduit that made it a particularly appealing conduit for her to use in the summer of 2013. Instead, Twitter's unique format allowed her to revise and strategically deploy the favorable texts from Hillary meme, capitalizing on positive momentum that was drummed up by the 2012 Tumblr sensation. Although Clinton's inaugural tweet referenced the text from Hillary meme, it also signaled Hillary's intention to take control of the message when she said, "I'll take it from here." By 2 p.m. on the day she launched her Twitter profile, the New York Daily News announced that Team Hillary tweeters are pouring in to support the presumed presidential candidate, and the LA Times reported that Clinton racked up more than 86,000 followers in just a few hours, a total that already topped, at that time, other 2016 Democratic presidential hopefuls. Now, despite these early reports, the question remains as to whether or not the tweets from Hillary meme provides the rhetorical resources necessary for Clinton to transform the texts from Hillary post-feminist fantasy into political reality. Although she tweets infrequently, sending only 23 tweets between June and September of this year, her Twitter bio fosters kind of a post-feminist assumption that women can have and be at all. Right? She lists herself as wife, mom, lawyer, women and kids advocate, etc., and ends with the nebulous TBD. The fact that a lot of people filled in that TBD with the phrase U.S. president, wondering if this was her signal that she was launching her campaign, many people use that as an example to suggest that in 2013, people may be more open now to a woman president even than they were 5 or 6 years ago. However, there's a problem. The problem with post-feminism is that it claims gender equity even as it masks cultural misogyny. So as long as journalists and citizens can support Clinton as a potential presidential candidate, then by turning text from Hillary into a viral sensation or following @Hillary Clinton on Twitter, any opposition to her as an actual presidential contender is inoculated against charges of sexism. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting here that any opposition to Hillary Clinton means that you're a sexist. It's absolutely possible to not vote for her and to be opposed to her political policies for reasons other than sexism. But what the 2008 Democratic presidential primary demonstrated is that opposition to Clinton often took the form of language that denigrated her gender or promoted negative stereotypes about women and leadership. With the tweets from Hillary meme, that history recedes from public memory, effortlessly replaced by a post-feminist narrative that denies its sustained relevance. That makes it possible for misogyny to flourish, even as its routine presence in the culture is denied. Mary Douglas Vavris contends that the impulse to post a politics is one rooted in a generally decent, if misguided, belief that our society has reached the moment in which we are living out all of our lives on an equal playing field. As women strive to credibly establish presidential personae, we are tempted to equate our very modest progress with success. Consequently, the depiction of a woman who was once reviled in U.S. culture cheerfully gaining the upper hand in imagined exchanges with politicians, CEOs, and celebrities is appealing. For some, this meme provides the rhetorical resources for arguing that women deserve legitimacy as presidential candidates. For others, it offers dubious proof that they already have it. The London Guardian's coverage of texts from Hillary lauds Clinton's authority while intimating that she should be satisfied with a subordinate position, saying, "She's managing the foreign policy and foreign relations of the most popular or powerful country in the world, with, as far as we know, the full support and thanks of the President of the United States. What's not to be happy about?" Indeed, one of the most powerful components of post-feminism is the antidote it ostensibly provides to the supposed dour feminism of the 1970s. In a post-feminist era, women are free to enjoy their physical, sexual, and consumer power. Hillary Clinton, as both a fulfilled wife and Secretary of State in this narrative, should be happy with her place in U.S. political culture. In other words, you've come a long way, baby. Hillary Clinton is herself a unique figure in U.S. presidential culture. In 2 separate presidential campaigns, the media have tagged her as a frontrunner before she even jumped into the race. Her political resume and broad popularity are cited as evidence that we have entered a presidential post-feminist era. Today, I've suggested that although it's true that our presidential politics are decidedly post-feminist, that doesn't necessarily pave women's way to the White House. Social media allows citizens and journalists to endorse post-feminist fictional avatars, even as they reject actual feminist politics. In June of 2013, the Daily Beast quoted Stacey Lamb and his reaction to Hillary Clinton's first tweet. "I think it's safe to say that Hillary Clinton won the internet," he said. In the context of post-feminist political culture, winning the internet proves to be an easier task than winning the U.S. presidency. Thank you. I can take questions. Thanks very much. Does anybody have any questions? Should I do like I do with my students and throw out candy to anyone who asks a question?
Hello.
Hey, thanks for asking a question.
Well, it's not really a question, more of a comment, but I just wanted to focus on something you said towards the end, which is not only is there this, because I basically agree with you, but not only is there the look at how far people have come narrative, there's also the response to pretty much any form of misogyny in politics, whether it's from the left or from the right, because, you know, during 08 and 12, there was misogyny on the left too.
Absolutely, yeah.
But in both cases, you saw many, many prominent politicos in both parties saying this is an isolated incident. Like there's no such thing as like a structural problem. It's all individual and it's all isolated. And it's two sides of the same coin, you know? Like, and I just think, well, people may quibble with these particular examples. I think the general phenomenon works.
Absolutely. And in our book, it's a very multi-partisan book in that we take on not only the criticism that Clinton received in her framing, but also the unfair framing that Sarah Palin received. And the attacks are different, the tone is different. You know, Hillary Clinton got the C word applied to her, but Sarah Palin was known as the national MILF. And so they are absolutely, as you say, two sides of the same coin. And it's highly problematic. And it's tough for women in politics, women who go out, you know, on the campaign trail, because you can't really complain about it as a structural problem, right? Even when Hillary Clinton literally has people holding up signs that say, "Iron my shirt," it's really hard for her to come out and talk about structural sexism because that gets you kind of pegged as an angry feminist. In the same way that Barack Obama had to tread very lightly around issues of race so that he wouldn't be labeled an angry black man. And Michelle Obama, you know, got that angry black woman label early on in his tenure, his campaign and his early tenure as president. And I think a really good contrast, if you look at conservative politicians, is when Michelle Bachmann was briefly the front runner for the 2012 Republican presidential nomination. And she got lambasted as crazy. I mean, she had there was that cover of Newsweek with her looking weird, and they're like, "Oh, look at Michelle Bachmann's crazy eyes. She's a lunatic." What was really interesting is that she was the Tea Party darling until Rick Perry really stepped up his campaign. And Michelle Bachmann and Rick Perry's campaign positions were virtually identical. But the moment people could shift from a female face for the Tea Party to a male face for the Tea Party, they fled. And Rick Perry, although he did get tagged as extreme from the right wing, nobody called him literally certifiably crazy, which is the tag that Michelle Bachmann gets most often. It's not like, "Oh, she's crazy because she's so different from me." It's like she's literally needs to be committed is how people respond to her, even though Rick Perry's politics are virtually identical. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi. We good? Yeah. Sorry. My question is for you. What do you feel like that we need to change socially in order to have female president? Do you think it starts in schools or just?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one thing that we need to do on an individual level is we need to call it out. We need to call it out the same way that we call racism out, the same way that we call out homophobia. We need to call it out and just say it's not okay. And that's the one, when we started writing this book, one difficulty was a lot of books on the market right now about gender in the U.S. presidency talk about what do women candidates need to do to become electable. And the more we did the research, we said there's literally nothing they can do to become more electable. I mean, the women who are at this level of politics are way more qualified than most of the men that they're running against. They literally can't do anything else. We really need to change as a society. And I think the first step towards that is for all of us to take sexism as seriously as we as a society have taken racism, saying that we haven't solved that problem either. Right, that problem is not solved. But I believe that interpersonally it needs to happen. And that's why kind of a communication sensibility is so important, because a lot of this is framing. It's how issues are framed in political dialogue. It's how we frame things in interpersonal communication. So a communication perspective really does give us the equipment that we need to go in and solve these problems in our daily lives. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I don't know if this is on. I was wondering if, thinking about how to respond to this post-feminist argument, recently the women in the Senate were part of this bipartisan compromise, and so I was wondering whether you think that difference feminism, this sort of argument that women bring something new to the table or something different, especially maybe in a very gridlocked Washington, would that be a frame that would work?
You know, it's a tricky thing. So I think the difference feminism frame, as you know from kind of an academic perspective, argues that women are different either because of our nature, we're sort of biologically different and that makes us different, or because of our nurture. We come from these differing realms of society and that enables us to have different skills. And I think that success that you see with women politicians, both at the state level and federally, is linked to this experiential difference, that we kind of, you know, I think it was Margaret Thatcher that said, if you want something you know, said in politics, ask a man. If you want something done, ask a woman. And she kind of came up through the parliamentary system where she really had to work the system in order to become leader of the party. But all of the research suggests that women legislators are better at cooperation than male legislators. And so, and I think it's interesting too that although the women in the Senate did broker the deal that eventually got passed, those were not the faces that we saw when it actually came to we're signing the agreement, we're opening the government back up again. So there does seem to be a disparity between who's doing the hard work behind the scenes and who gets to be the face of the party, whether it's the Speaker of the House or as a presidential candidate. But I think we do need more women in positions in electoral positions. But that also means that we have to make electoral positions ones that are sustainable in various stages of life. Because most of the women that we see in electoral politics start politics in their 50s, and that's not an accident, right? It's because that's when they have time. That's when they can throw themselves into it. Well, if you're starting 20 or 30 years later than your male counterparts, it's perhaps not surprising that you're not able to rise to the level of leadership positions with the same frequency as men. But yeah, that's a good. Did you have a? There's yeah.
Who paid for that highly sexualized ad for Obama? What organization?
The Lena Dunham, the girls ad, the very first time I voted. Is that the one you're?
No, the second one with Obama.
Oh. Yeah. Oh, the crush on Obama. That video. That was. You know, I don't even know if it was a political operative. That launched the website barelypolitical.com, and so that was somebody who was very interested in making money off of all of the. It wasn't a political ad. It was a viral video, but it functioned as a political ad. It wasn't sponsored by either of the campaigns, but it functioned as a political ad. And that's something, actually, the memes are another thing, that campaigns are really trying to find ways to use these alternative discourses, whether it's Twitter and social media or viral videos. They're trying to create them, and actually a lot of jobs for people coming out of programs like yours, those who are studying politics or communication at places like this, they want young people who can tell them how to, you know, like do Twitter right, and can you create a meme that will be taken up? Campaigns themselves haven't had very much luck in making things that they create go viral, so they're trying to crack that nut. But yeah, that one in particular was it was cashing in on the enthusiasm among young people for Obama, but it really made this Amberly Ettinger a star, and it made barelypolitical.com a really lucrative website. So that's a good question. Yeah.
I have a question of detail and a more speculative question. You said you cited a scholar who had said that from the 1840s or 50s into the early 2000s, the same patterns of representation in the media. What are those patterns? That's the detail question. And secondly, could you comment on theories of the feminization of poverty at the other end of the economic ladder, adding class to the mix in terms of ways that poverty is understood in personalized terms when it may in fact have structural gender components?
Absolutely.
We could link from this elite group to a wider base of women. That would be interesting to hear as well.
Right. Thank you for those questions. The first one, Erica Falk's research said the patterns that she was studying in terms of that kept repeating themselves in all of these cases where women ran for president were patterns like women candidates are not covered as frequently as male candidates. When they are covered, they're framed using highly gendered terms. And it's some of the research we've heard a lot about, which is stories tend to comment on women's experience or appearances rather than their policies, really sort of surface stories like that. They also talk about the supporters of women, and this was interesting because it was really relevant for Hillary Clinton, but it also happened to Elizabeth Dole when she was stumping for the presidential nomination, is that when women support women presidential candidates, it's looked upon as kind of a special interest, like, oh, you're just voting for her because you're a woman. But when women support male presidential candidates, or when men, and more importantly, when men support male presidential candidates, nobody said, you're supporting him because he's the same gender as you. Like, nobody ever says that about a male presidential candidate. So it's those kinds of framing patterns that started in 1884 and were still present in 2007. Regarding the feminization issue as it is related to class, this actually was a big point of contention with the Sex and the City voter construct, because they said, look, not all unmarried single women are under 28 and have this particular Sex and the City appearance about them or have the money to be financially independent. That's a very specific subset of women. And so I think that when you're ignoring the larger structural issues as it comes across in politics, structural inequalities in politics, it's also because that narrative of personal responsibility is more appealing to us in America, right? I mean, we're in the live free or die state, and so we've got that narrative that you don't really need a structure to be successful. If you're successful, it's because of personal initiative. If you're not economically successful, it's because of lack of personal initiative. And so that's just an oversimplified narrative, as we all know. But I think that the media, in particular, makes use of oversimplified narratives that then have these terrible deleterious consequences. Thank you. Let's see, do we have, yeah.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Abdulaziz Sharawi, and I'm a sophomore here at St. Anselm College. It's an amazing talk. It's so interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question regarding reacting against anti-feminism. So, for example, if we're going to take Argentina, who have a successful story with a president with a woman president reaching office. So how can we learn from that? How did they conquer it? And I think there are several other Asian countries that have the same experience. So,
this is a huge issue. Not only in terms of women being elected to the top office in countries, but also women's representation in legislatures or parliamentary bodies internationally. The United States ranks really low in terms of developed democracies, in terms of numbers of women, and also the highest position to which women have risen. And we do talk about this a little bit in our book. One of the reasons, a lot of countries that have, especially real conservative countries that still have more representation of women in their parliaments, some of them have quota systems. So they say, look, we need alternate perspectives in our parliaments, and so we're going to require that X number of representatives are women. So that's one way that they do that. But another way, in particular, that women rise to the level of prime minister or president, a lot of it is within those parliamentary structures rather than our U.S. presidential structure. So you don't have to sell yourself to the whole country at once. You just have to kind of work within your party, and that's the part that women have been particularly good at. That goes back to the Senate women brokered the budget deal, because they're particularly good at working through that system behind the scenes. But when you put somebody up in a public campaign where they have to ask for everybody's vote, then our stereotypes about women in leadership do those candidates a disadvantage. So that's one reason. The third reason why it's hard for us to compare you know, say the president of Argentina or Angela Merkel or something to the U.S. president, is that the U.S. presidency is a unique role in the world. No other leader of the state is sort of tagged with the term leader of the free world. Not all presidents are also commanders-in-chief. Many leaders of state, heads of state, don't also have this ceremonial function. So in the book, we talk about the ways in which the president is kind of stands in for the ideal American citizen, and the first family stands in as the ideal American family. And so anything that you get that kind of trips that up, whether it's, well, our ideal American family can't have a male first lady, that's disjunctive to us, or, well, this citizen, a woman can't stand for everybody in the same way that a man stands for everybody, which of course he doesn't, but we accept that he does. Because of those features, the U.S. presidency is a little bit different even than other leaders in other countries. And a lot of these countries, particularly if they come from monarchical backgrounds, they do have strong women leaders in their history. You might have to go several centuries back, but they're there. That's in the narrative of the country. That's in their story. And that's not in our story yet. So we're hoping that we don't have to wait another 100 years before it is part of our story. Thank you. Yes?
Professor, I just have a question. Much of your work deals with the consequences of what the media has done.
Mm-hmm.
But if you could just talk a little bit about, I don't know if it's psychology or journalistic practice, but many of the people who create and frame those narratives you were describing that are hostile to the advancement of women are well-educated people who, in conversation on the cocktail circuit, would deplore the very narratives that you've outlined as being less than helpful. Why does that happen? And how does that happen? We might understand a particular network choosing a particular narrative, but surely this is a very pervasive problem. And I'd be interested in what your own research has shown about the journalistic practice whereby this consequence occurs.
Right. That's a great question. And there are a number of answers, but at least two that jump to mind initially. One is that journalists are always looking for the salacious story. And so that's why if you have a paper that covers, let's say that there's a pro-life rally on one side of the street and a pro-choice rally on the other side of the street, and the same paper covers it, both advocates from both positions are probably going to feel like they got the raw end of the deal. They're probably going to feel like the media was biased against them. And that's because, you know, at each rally, they're going to go find the most exaggerated or most radical representative of that side and put it up on the news. So some of it is just that we're looking for the salaciousness. Some of it is the 24-hour news cycle. So Obama Girl, for example, Amber Lee Ettinger, got a lot of play in serious news sites because they had to fill time. And Chris Matthews, for one, he went on and on and on, sort of fell over himself when she was on his program, saying, you know, oh, well, I usually have these talking heads on my show, but I'd much rather hang out with you. And it was kind of that creepy old, ooh. I'd much rather turn the channel now. But I think it's because newsrooms were getting pressured to sell paper and to move copy. Well, newspapers themselves are closing. So there's this notion that, well, sex sells in every other realm, and guess what? It also sells in politics. So that's the second reason. The third reason that I think that it is more common even among, you know, that this sort of really obvious sexism and really sort of violent misogyny is tolerated or kind of winds its way in even educated circles, is because we don't take sexism as seriously as we take other forms of discrimination. It's the proponents of, you know, women's rights are seen as whiners, or it's not necessary, or what are you complaining about? Oh, you're complaining, Sarah Palin, because they're calling you too pretty. Oh, isn't that a terrible problem to have, you know? And so it's sort of, we can make light of it. I mean, you can still laugh at a misogynistic joke in polite company, and you can't in other kinds of situations. And so I think it's more common because we still tolerate it. I mean, that's the bottom line. We still tolerate it. Thank you very much, everybody. This is a great conversation.